Plotinus, the Enneads. 6:8 On Free Will and the Will of the One, Chapter 2. A cardinal question is where we are to place the freedom of action ascribed to us. It must be found in impulse or in some appetite, as when we act or omit in lust or rage, or upon some calculation of advantage accompanied by desire. But if rage or desire implied freedom, we must allow freedom to animals, infants, maniacs, the distraught, the victims of malpractice producing incontrollable delusions. And if freedom turns on calculation with desire, does this include faulty calculation? Sound calculation, no doubt, and sound desire. But then comes the question whether the appetite steers the calculation or the calculation the appetite. Where the appetites are dictated by the very nature, they are either the desires of the conjoint of soul and body, and then soul lies under physical compulsions, or they spring in the soul as an independent, and then much that we take to be voluntary is in reality outside of our free act. Further, does the soul advance any reasoning which is free from emotion? And can a compelling imagination, an appetite drawing us where it will, be supposed to leave us masters in the ensuing act? How can we be masters when we are compelled? Need, inexorably craving satisfaction, is not free in face of that to which it is forced. And how at all can a thing have efficiency of its own when it rises from an extern? Has an extern for very principle, thence taking its being as it stands? It lives by that extern, lives as it has been molded. If this be freedom, there is freedom in even the soulless. Fire acts in accordance with its characteristic being. We may be reminded that the living form and the soul know what they do, but if this is knowledge by perception, it does not help towards the freedom of the act. Perception gives awareness, not mastery. If true knowing is meant, either this is the knowing of something happening, once more awareness, with the motive force still to seek, or the reasoning and knowledge have acted to quell the appetite. Then we have to ask to what this repression is to be referred, and where it has taken place. If it is that the mental process sets up an opposing desire, we must assure ourselves how. If it merely stills the appetite with no further efficiency, and this is our freedom, then freedom does not depend upon act, but is a thing of the mind. And in truth, all that has to do with act, the very most reasonable, is still a mixed value and cannot carry freedom. Chapter 3. All this calls for examination. The inquiry must bring us close to the solution as regards the gods. We have traced self-disposal to will to reasoning, and next step to right reasoning. Perhaps to right reasoning we must add knowledge, for however sound opinion and act may be, they do not yield true freedom. When the adoption of the right course is in the result of hazard, or of some presentiment from the fancy with no knowledge of the foundation of that rightness. Taking it that the presentment of fancy is not a matter of our will and choice, how can we think those acting at its dictation to be free agents? Fancy strictly in our use takes its rise from conditions of the body, lack of food and drink, steps up presentments, and so does the meeting of these needs, similarly with the seminal abundance and other humors of the body. We refuse to range under the principle of freedom those whose conduct is directed by such fancy. The baser sort, therefore, mainly so guided, cannot be credited with self-disposal or voluntary act. Self-disposal to us belongs to those who, through the activities of the intellectual principle, live above the states of the body. The spring of freedom is the activity of intellectual principle, the highest in our being. The proposals emanating thence are freedom. Such desires as are formed in the exercise of the intellectual act cannot be classed as involuntary. The gods, therefore, that live in this state, living by intellectual principle, and by desire conforming to it, possess freedom. Chapter 4. It will be asked how act rising from desire can be voluntary, since desire pulls outward and implies need. To desire it is still to be drawn, even though towards the good. Intellectual principle itself comes under the doubt. Having a certain nature and acting by that nature, can it be said to have freedom and self-disposal? In an act which it cannot leave enacted? Do that again. Intellectual principle itself comes under the doubt. Having a certain nature and acting by that nature, can it be said to have freedom and self-disposal? In an act which it cannot leave unenacted? It may be asked, also, whether freedom may strictly be affirmed of such things as are not engaged in action. However, that may be. Where there is such act, there is compulsion from without, since failing motive, act will not be performed. These higher beings, too, obey their own nature, where then is their freedom. But on the other hand, can there be talk of constraint where there is no compulsion to obey an extern? And how can any movement towards a good be counted compulsion? Effort is free once it is towards the fully recognized good. The involuntary is precisely motion away from a good and towards the enforced, towards something not recognizing a good. Servitude lies in being powerless to move towards one's good, being debarred from the preferred path in a menial obedience. Hence the shame of slavedom is incurred not only when one is held from the hurtful, but when the personal good must be yielded in the favor of another's. Further, this objected obedience to the characteristic nature would imply a duality, master and mastered, but an undivided principle, a simple activity, where there can be no difference of potential and act, must be free. There can be no thought of action according to the nature, in the sense of any distinction between the being and its efficiency, where being and act are identical, where act is performed neither because of another nor at another's will, there surely is freedom. Freedom may of course be an inappropriate term. There is something greater here. It is self-disposal in the sense only that there is no disposal of the extern, no outside master over the act. In a principle, act and essence must be free. No doubt intellectual principle itself is to be referred to yet a higher, but this higher is not extern to it. Intellectual principle is within the good, possessing its own good in virtue of that indwelling. Much more will it possess freedom and self-disposal, which are sought only for the sake of the good. Acting towards the good, it must all the more possess self-disposal, for by that act it is directed towards the principle from which it proceeds, and this its act is self-centered and must entail its very greatest good.